And one of our goals is to work collaboratively with other commissions to really find solutions that will bring people up and target the system as not just a specific element of it. Looking at zero waste, we're really, really proud of the rollout of the organics recycling. It's amazing that we've gotten as the higher percentage as we have. And we're looking at how to make that higher. And one of the things that we're hoping to tackle this year is multi-unit apartment buildings and commercial waste streams. So those have been identified as concerns to getting, or as barriers to getting to the city to zero waste. We also want to continue our work on the Bring Your Own Bag ordinance. That was a we were all very proud of the work that we did in the commission to get to where it got, and want to make sure that it is that the troubles that come with implementation of any ordinance are that we're there to help work on those issues and implement it fully. When the water committee, of course, has been working on a lot of really amazing things. This year, salt has become is becoming a big issue at the forefront of what we're all thinking about, especially with the Star Tribune article acknowledging the chloride levels in most of our lakes. Looking at salt and other toxins as they come off the roadways and incorporating those issues into the Complete Streets policy. Those are going to be big big tasks for our water group. We call it the pool party. And they're also trying to look at the potential purchase of the Kmart site as a space for innovation when it comes to water usage and capture, as well as environmental construction from the ground up. It's rare that we get an opportunity like that to have such a large space in an already built out city to really look at it from the ground up. So our climate and energy and air group, one of the things that has come up recently is electric vehicles and our goal of bringing Minneapolis to where a lot of other municipalities are in terms of infrastructure and support for other modes of transportation that don't depend on exclusively on petroleum. And then lastly, the comprehensive plan. We worked a lot last year and want to continue working both in an advisory capacity as well as in a data collection and the capacity when it comes to the strategic or the comp plan. Excuse me. We only get one shot at this every 10 years. So we're working on this. We've created our own task force and have been working on this issue, both in conjunction with CPED. So lastly, we have recommendations. One of them, our first one, Chair Gordon already took care of, or began to take care of earlier last year, or right this year. I'm forgetting, but he invited all of the commissions and committees under his the HECE to meet and talk. And out of that was amazing finding out what other commissions are working on, but also realizing that some of us are working on the same things and being able to add our collective resources together to either expedite the work that's being done or broaden the work that's being done. And we see that as especially after our work on the tire issue and other issues as a real good that we can be doing is to just pool our resources. Also, the last note is we want to make sure that City Council and the city staff fills the sustainability director position as quickly as possible. We really appreciate the work that Gail's done, and want to make sure that we continue getting the great level of support and that she's given us. And lastly, if council wants, they could ask Gail to speak, but that's where I'll leave it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that report and the work you've done and the recommendations there. I think the recommendations we're going to all take as encouragement, I think, from SEAC, not anything that we necessarily have to act on right now today. But I appreciated your reminder about the meeting and the coordinating the groups. I think we did commit to loop back with everybody, and it's probably time we get organized and try to do that. I also want to note that I think at one slide you talked about equitable engagement, and one of the other groups is the Community Engagement Commission that is also very involved in that to work with. Any other committee members have any questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, then I will move to receive and file the presentation and the report. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say no. Okay, that motion carries. That brings us to our last item. This is our last discussion item, and this is a presentation on the Minneapolis Green Zones Work Group and recommendations. I will just let committee members know or remind you that there is a map and a resolution that is drafted that I plan to move after this that should be before you, and there's also copies of it provided over by the clerk if folks would like to take a look at that. But don't forget to enjoy the presentation, and I've told Kelly she can take 20 minutes if she'd like. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Gordon and council members. My name is Kelly Molman. I work with the City Coordinator's Office of Sustainability, and I'm here today to present to you the recommendations of the city's Green Zone Work Group. I want to start by acknowledging the significance and the challenge of creating an initiative that addresses the existing conditions of environmental injustice, as well as historic private and government practices that created the current inequities. It's a lot to unpack, and there are systemic challenges that this one initiative cannot solve. Substantial policy changes are needed, and this one project is one among many that is required. That said, the work group members courageously stepped up to the challenge and wrestled through some really difficult, emotional, and raw conversations to create the recommendations that I'm here to present today. It was an incredibly humbling experience that forced me to confront my white privilege on a daily basis. And I want to start this presentation by thanking the work group members who came to the table and stuck with me over the past year, many of whom are in the audience today. I also want to recognize the many more staff, external partners, and focus group participants in North, South, and Northeast communities that provided invaluable input on the development of the recommendations. As a recap, the idea for the Green Zones Initiative comes from the Minneapolis Climate Action Plan, which City Council adopted in 2013. A green zone is a place-based initiative aimed at improving health and supporting economic development using environmentally friendly strategies in communities that face the cumulative effects of environmental pollution, as well as social, political, and economic vulnerability. This work has been building for nearly 4 years, with several City Council actions advancing it to where we are today. In February of last year, City Council passed the Green Zones Work Group resolution, establishing a Green Zones Work Group with broad representation reflecting geographic, experiential, and cultural diversity. The resolution tasked the work group to develop data-driven recommendations around criteria and eligibility requirements of green zone designation, goals and metrics for each designated green zone, and strategies to achieve the environmental health and economic development goals. Last November, I came back to this committee and gave an update on the work group's progress, and at that time received a staff direction to look at research best practices on gentrification and displacement mitigation. I will touch briefly on the research that we conducted, and which is important to ensure that the green zones related improvements do not price out or displace residents. Our focus is revitalization. It allows residents to stay in the neighborhood to enjoy the new amenities from investments made into the community. As a disclaimer, sustainability staff are not experts in this subject, and this is just a pulling together of research. From the sources reviewed, preservation and provision of affordable housing was the most important effective strategy to combat displacement. There are many ways the city can be active in this, such as inclusionary zoning, permitting smaller lot or unit sizes, and supporting affordable developments financially. Many things the city is already doing or exploring. Another key point is recognizing how each choice we make as government officials, business leaders, and developers to promote economic development, whether it be funding, permit approval, public investment, policy adoption, and more assigns value to and prioritizes some communities over others. There's no easy choices, but we must acknowledge that our choosing does have consequences. In summer 2016, the city received a Minnesota Pollution Control Agency environmental assistance grant to support the work group and as well to support community engagement. The work group decided to facilitate a series of focus groups in February and March of this past year. In the end, we held a total of 7 focus groups, 2 in Northeast, 3 in North, and 2 in Phillips, one of which was in Spanish. We had about 9 to 15 people at each of the focus groups. And through the grant, we were able to provide stipends, dinner, childcare, and travel reimbursement. The focus group participants were presented with the work group's recommendations for goals, strategies, and designation criteria. I've grouped their feedback under the green zone goal areas and under other key themes. Overall, the focus group participants were supportive of the work group's recommendations, validated the work presented to them, and added more to the conversation. Related to air, water, and soil quality, there was a strong desire to have data and evidence about contamination levels, to monitor air quality, and to prioritize the cleanup of contamination, as well as work with the community on any brownfield redevelopment. Green jobs, or jobs generally, was one of the 2 highest priorities across all focus groups. Great emphasis was placed on the need for training and apprenticeships for green jobs or jobs in the green zone, as well as addressing barriers to jobs and training, such as criminal record, education, and experience. If you have a good paying job, a lot of other issues fall in line, our focus group members told us. Affordable housing is less of an issue, crime lowers, gentrification doesn't displace residents, and more. Around greening and food access, focus group participants discussed access to parks and opportunities to garden, especially for renters, as well as loosening restrictions on gardening and selling food products. Housing was the other highest priority among focus group participants. They were eager to talk about lead testing and awareness, as well as improving energy efficiency, but made it clear that renters with evictions, unlawful detainers, income less than 3 times greater than rent, or poor credit cannot access housing that is healthy, safe, and efficient, let alone the programs to improve their housing. Participants said affordable housing is a priority. Unaffordable housing creates evictions. These are the barriers we have to address to get the healthy, environmentally focused work done in a green zone. And finally, other focus group comments included emphasizing building community and not just improving a place, but building a culture of connected people, increasing community awareness so the community can have input, and focusing on impacted communities and not displacing people. Related to the designation criteria, participants liked that we used a data-driven approach and that the focus was on the most vulnerable populations. Questions did arise around how future areas would be selected or potentially expanded, and concern was raised about not letting other areas of the city become less green as a result of concentrating efforts in specific parts of the city. So now I'll get into the work group's recommendations for goals and strategies. The work group identified and prioritized 7 goals for the green zone. At the core is to use equity and gentrification as a lens for all of the strategies and activities that you see here. The next several slides, I will go into detail for each of the goal areas, including how we talked about the core components, which is what you would traditionally think of as our environmental programs, and critical considerations, which is how we're looking at addressing equity and gentrification. These are not guarantees or promises, but more important information about what the work group discussed at length that should be considered as we move into the next phase. For equity and gentrification, as a lens, it's about who's at the table, who's making the decisions, and who benefits. I want to point out that we were using the term equity in the context of racial and economic equity. For each goal area, we developed some possible metrics for measuring progress and impact. I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, mostly because the work group had insufficient time to discuss the metrics. As well, the metrics should be updated and refined for each green zone based on the adopted action plan. The main point here is that to measure success should be based on whether conditions and outcomes have improved for those who are the worst off. For the goal of soil and water contamination cleanup, the key here is to address potential contamination on sites the community has identified and to involve community in the cleanup and redevelopment process. For the next goal, greening, the core point is incorporating native trees, pollinator-friendly vegetation, weatherization, and clean energy into community businesses and homes in ways that create opportunities for community ownership of projects as well as training and jobs. The goal for addressing air and environmental quality in businesses and transportation focuses on leveraging and blending existing programs and resources to reduce pollution and increase energy efficiency, as well as understand better the cumulative impact of all of these activities on the community's health. Green jobs was consistently one of the most important goals and priorities. The discussion around this goal area was about job access and barriers related to background checks and how to ensure that local communities are able to tap into the growing green sector economy. Healthy, affordable housing that is available to all people was also one of the most important goals and priorities. Most of the discussion on this topic was about barriers to accessing quality, affordable housing and a lack of awareness or information around the resources to improve the housing environment. Major concern was the potential increase in housing costs when improvements are made and the need to control rising housing costs to prevent displacement. For the goal of creating healthy, affordable food access, most of the work group and focus group conversations were about gardening, and not much was said around stores or markets. So now I'm going to get into the proposed green zone designation criteria that the work group came up with. As a reminder, the Green Zones resolution stated that recommendations for criteria and eligibility requirements of the green zone designation be based on specific data sets, including environmental issues, land, air, and water, as well as race and income, to create basic overlays to demonstrate the intensity of the intersection of these factors. So here's a list of the data that we use to establish criteria. The list on the left includes the environmental factors related to each of the priority areas or goal areas. And the list on the right is our equity evaluation, or how we looked at population vulnerability. So here are the basic overlays using the data listed in the previous slide. This data is presented by census tract and broken out by percentiles. The darkest red is the 90th percentile, or the worst 10% off, and the darkest blue is the 10th percentile, or the least burden. This is the criteria the work group is recommending the council use to designate green zones. While the work group did not recommend specific boundaries, the next few slides show some possible ways to develop green zone designation based on the criteria. One approach would be to designate green zones where environment and equity evaluation are both the 60th percentile or higher in a given census tract. Similarly, you could go where environment and equity evaluations are above the 80th percentile within a census tract to identify where there is higher burden or have smaller areas of focus. The work group also came up with a single green zone designation concept, which they fondly refer to as the donut. These maps highlight where both environment and equity evaluations could create a singular green zone designation. The boundaries here are for illustrative purposes only. This map combines the environment and equity data into one map with equity and environmental factors equally weighted. We hope that council uses this data to inform the designation of the green zones area and pilot. It will be important to intentionally document the experience and learnings from a pilot green zone to inform future communities. In addition to mapping burden, we also mapped existing place-based initiatives, both public and private, as a way to identify where there may be other models or initiatives that we want to work with. Additionally, we started to document potential partners or existing programs. We want to be intentional and effective with resources, dovetailing with existing programs and partners such as the Clean Energy Partnership, Homegrown Minneapolis, the health department's Lead and Healthy Homes and Green Business Cost Share programs, federal weatherization, and utility energy efficiency programs, just to name a few. I'm now going to invite a couple work group members to step up and share some comments that they have prepared. And it looks like we just have one work group member, Louis Alamayo.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This feels to me like a pretty important moment in that we are all caught up in a really profound, expansive historical moment. And what comes to mind most immediately is, what would my ancestors and my mentors want me to say at this time? And so I'm going to have to see what they want me to say. As a lot of you probably know, for several hundred years, we have been on a track that can be defined as the Industrial Revolution. And that, in essence, has come in conflict with what I would call indigenous wisdom. And indigenous wisdom is something that has existed all across the planet, where our ancestors, in whatever village they lived in, they knew that they had to live in balance with the water, the vegetation, the animals, and other groups of people. And so cultures, our really ancient cultures, our old cultures, really placed a value on balance. How do you live in balance on the land and in communication with your ancestors? So there's a way where many of us who are still really paying attention to our ancestral roots, our indigenous roots, what we've noticed over hundreds of years is that the attack and exploitation of the environment mirrors the attack upon our cultures, which has been overlays with many of our experiences of what we call historical trauma. There are two people that I hope you've been exposed to. One would be Dmitry Orlov, who has written and talked extensively about collapse. He grew up in Russia, came here as a preteen, and has a really good sense of what happened in Russia when it collapsed. And after being in the US from the age of around 12 to now, I think he's in his 40s, paying attention to what happens when a society collapses economically. So that is worth reading and reflecting upon as you make decisions. The other person I would recommend is Wendell Berry, who wrote The Idea of a Local Economy. And he really pointed out the fact that we've been depending upon oil and coal, and now we're in a place where we cannot ignore, although some people still ignore, that our uses of oil and coal have really strained the environment. And there's things that we've been doing for at least 200 years that are going to play out no matter what we do. And that is often called extreme weather. And we've already had experiences with that, and it's going to keep playing out. So we have to reclaim a kind of wisdom that pays attention to the need to be in balance with each other as human beings, with other species, and with the elements of this creation. So I also know in this moment that going back to even ancient Egypt, they wrote about the fact that our clock, our universal clock, would end in 2012 and start up again. And just coincidentally, many other cultures have said exactly the same thing. The people of Iceland in Northern Europe, they said there would come a time when disharmony amongst human beings would also be reflected in the environment. We are living that, experiencing that. The Mayans and the Hopis said that 2012 would be the end and the beginning. So our challenge right now is, how do we create a culture that holds all of us and puts us back on track to be back in harmony with the exquisite logic of how the creation works, the intersection of all life and all beings. How do we reclaim that in order that this child sitting right there has a vibrant future? That's our job right now. And it's going to require something more than courage, as we've thought about it before, because we're facing the unknown in a lot of ways. And we have to step up to this challenge because our children and grandchildren need us to no longer work from 20th century assumptions in the 21st century. So I thank you for